Welcome to week 2 of our series, I Declare War, a series noting how worship is our weapon. Now, last week, Corey shared with us how worship is essentially taking our attention, our adoration, and our affection and putting it squarely on God Himself. He shared that worship is a lifestyle. It's more than singing, but certainly singing is a part of what worship is. And so we're exploring the meaning and the connection between some of the songs we sing and the scriptures that birthed them. Today we're looking at that hymn that we just sung for us, and I know many of us sang along with it, and its basis in Psalm 46. Psalm 46. So if you have a Bible, turn to Psalm 46. This is what we read. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, even though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though the waters roar and foam and the mountains quake at their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fail. God will help her at the break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations that He has brought on the earth. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow. He shatters the spear. He burns the shield with fire. He says, "Be still. Know that I am God. I will be exalted in the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." I love that psalm. The last verses there are probably some of the most well-known verses in the scriptures. Be still and know that I am God. How many of you have ever been to a sports game and missed a crucial moment because somebody has stood up in front of you? Any of you had that happen? Now, if you go to a Premier League game, a soccer game in England, that will happen nearly all the time, and here's why. If you are a rule follower, you will know that you're supposed to sit in your seat. See, after the Heysel Stadium disaster in a number of years ago, all of the stadiums, soccer stadiums in Britain, were seating only. And so what you were supposed to do is you were always supposed to sit down. The only problem is, how many of you think people can stay sitting when their team win? Right? When their team score, it never happens. So if you're a rule follower, you basically miss a goal because you're the one who's sitting when everybody else is standing. Well, this week I went to a high school game, district final of my son. He was in his school team were in the district final. The game was tied 1-1 at the time, and we scored. We eventually won the game 3-1. But at one crucial moment, as the second goal was going in, somebody stood in front of me, and I missed a crucial part of it. Now, okay, I saw the ball go in the net. That's fine. The only problem was when Jordan came home, he said to me, "Dad, did you see that no-look pass that set up the tie-breaking goal?" And I was like, "No, I didn't," because somebody stood up in front of me. Now, the good thing is technology. We live in a day, can you believe it or not, that even high school sports are available on demand. So having heard that, I went online, looked up the game, saw the no-look pass, and I said, "Yeah, George, it was really good." Here's the point. Technology helps us get past something that we might have missed. Technology helps us get past something that we might have missed. I want to suggest to you, worship does the very same thing. I want to suggest to you that Psalm 46 is written to do the very same thing. This hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," was written to help you in worship do the same thing, to get past something that stands in your way so that you don't miss something that is crucial to your victory in the end. Psalm 46. Psalm 46 is an incredible psalm, popular, but we're not really sure what circumstance triggered its composition. Commentators believe, however, that the most likely scenario is that this psalm is based on an incredible event that happened in the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. They say that the occasion most likely has to do with a time when King Sennacherib of Assyria had amassed 185,000 troops outside the walls of Jerusalem. At this point in time, 46 towns and villages in the kingdom had already fallen, and 200,000 inhabitants had been taken captive. King Hezekiah prayed. The people around him believed that it was only a matter of time until the city would fall. But that was to reckon without God. That was to reckon without the power of prayer. And the book of Kings and Chronicles, Isaiah 36 and 37, tells the story. Hezekiah prays, the angel of the Lord descends, and 185,000 of Sennacherib's troops die. Psalm 46. If that's the context or not, the reality is that this psalm is based on a story where God delivers his people in a miraculous way, in the way that only he can. Psalm 46. When God's people read this psalm, when they recounted the events that stimulated it, they were essentially being encouraged to move beyond the battle that they were facing, maybe even the enemy that was encircling them. And they were encouraged to realize that God, their ever-present help, was with them, and all that needed to happen was for him to speak a word. This psalm was designed to take its readers beyond the emotional turmoil of their experience and plug them into a God who was an ever-present help. It was based on a historical reality. The hymn that we heard sung was written by Martin Luther, a German reformer. The hymn was written sometime between 1521 and 1529. Martin Luther's life was one constant battleground. Any number of events could have triggered the composition of that hymn. We really don't know what triggered it. What we do know is that Martin Luther would teach through the Psalms at university, and he loved this psalm. And he loved this psalm, and he would go back to this psalm when he faced opposition. Now, the opposition that Luther faced was the established church. See, Luther held and came to the conviction that salvation came not through the practices of the church, but salvation came through faith and was appropriated through grace and was appropriated to our lives by faith. And that caused the church, the established church, to rise up against him. And Luther would go to this psalm, and he eventually penned this hymn because he realized that while the church, the established church, was the face of his battle, the church wasn't the source of his battle, nor was it the ultimate enemy that he faced. That's why in this song, over and over again, it talks about the devil. In fact, Luther wrote about this hymn and this psalm these words. We sing this psalm, Psalm 46, this hymn that we just sung, to the praise of God because God is with us. and powerfully and miraculously preserves and defends what? His church. Notice that, please. The church is the face of his opposition. And he sings this song to help him realize that there are kind of two churches. There's the established church, but there is the church universal, the church invisible, the holy Catholic Church with a small c, to which all believers belong. God protects his church. He sang this song to get him beyond the established church that opposed him and to focus his mind on the God who builds his church, will protect his church. Jesus said the same thing. I will build my church and nothing, not even what? The gates of hell will come against it. Also, Luther says, and his word, and then he goes on. Corey talked about this last week. The three enemies that we face, never people. Three enemies. Against all the fanatical spirits, against the gates of hell, against the implacable hatred of the devil, and against all the assaults of the world, the flesh, and sin. Three enemies. The devil and all of his minions, the flesh and sin, and the patterns of this world. Luther sang this song to get him away from thinking that the people who opposed him were his ultimate enemy. They weren't. And worship was his weapon that enabled him to do that. Now, at one point, history records that Luther spent 11 months locked up in Wartburg Castle. 11 months. Do you understand now why Psalm 46 was so important to the guy? Psalm 46, 185,000 troops surrounding King Hezekiah. Luther locked up in Wartburg Castle with the troops of the established church there around him, making sure that he could not leave. There were some dark days as Luther was locked up there, and in the face of opposition, in the pressure to back down, Luther was not going to back down from his convictions that salvation came through grace by faith alone. But in those moments where fear gripped him, in those moments where depression overcame him, in those moments where life and the threat of losing it became so overwhelming, Luther would turn to his friend Philip and say, Philip, let's sing the 46th Psalm. And they would launch into this version. Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott, ein wahrer, ein guter Wehr und Waffen. Now I think, Mrs. Ray and Vipke, I think I got that right. Kind of, very good. But you know why I don't sing, right? They would just launch into this version of it. Why? Because in the moment when they felt overwhelmed, worship was the means that got them to look beyond their situation, put them in touch with the God who was ever present, and this God was able to speak a word and bring them what they needed in that moment. Now, this hymn became so popular, it was known as the battle hymn of the Reformation. The battle hymn of the Reformation. It was sung by believers as they were in churches, often to the disdain of the priests and the pastors. It was sung by the martyrs on their way to their death. It was sung by the exiles as they were leaving their homes. So whether you were famous or whether you were faceless, whether you were a noble or whether you were a no one, you would basically go to this hymn because in that moment, this hymn reminded you to look beyond the circumstances around you and put yourself in touch with the presence of a God who only has to speak a word and the world melts. Worship. This is what worship does. Worship is our weapon because it takes us beyond what stands in our way to the God who is at work behind it all. Now, what I want to do is I want to unpack that idea. Worship is our weapon because it takes us beyond the threats around us, beyond the suffering that we experience, beyond the opposition that we may encounter, and puts us in touch with the God who stands victorious behind it all. I want to unpack this, and I want to just work through what is actually involved in that, practically speaking, because every time we come in here and we worship and we sing, this is what we do. This is what we do. We're inviting us to move beyond the circumstances of the week, and we receive what we need in order to go out and live lives that make a difference. So what is involved with this? 3 thoughts based on this psalm and this hymn. First one is this: worship is our weapon when trouble targets the righteous. That's what this hymn and this psalm tells us. Worship is our weapon when trouble targets the righteous. Jesus said, look, to live is to have trouble. In this world, you will have trouble. You are simply going to experience trouble and suffering simply by virtue of the fact that you breathe and you live. To breathe is to be troubled at some point. But there is a trouble that actually targets followers of Jesus. Psalm 46 notes 3 types of trouble that happen. There are earthquakes, there's floods, there are wars. To live is to be troubled. But when we jump into the New Testament, we read in passages like Hebrews 11, for example, 35 through 38, that there is trouble that actively targets followers of Jesus. Homelessness, famine, murder, death. You can read the whole list there in Hebrews 11, 35 through 38. This hymn was born out of troubled experiences because people believed, Luther believed, the importance of salvation through grace by faith was something that should not ever be lost. And so worship was Luther's weapon when this trouble targeted him. I want to dig into this idea of trouble targeting us because I do believe that if we truly understand what is going on when trouble targets us, and when we truly understand the power of worship, maybe we move beyond the idea that worship is about style when it's actually about substance. So go with me here. Have a look at this text. This is 1 Peter 4. 1 Peter 4. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice, inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. So then those who suffer according to God's will, notice that please, there is a type of suffering that we all experience simply because we live and breathe, but there is also a type of suffering we experience which is according to God's will. According to God's will. What type of suffering do we experience according to God's will? The type of trouble that is caused to us because our enemies work against us. Our enemies, the devil and all of his minions, the patterns of this world, and our own flesh. There is a type of suffering there that we are to embrace because this is a type of trouble that is according to God's will. And that should not surprise us. What we should do, Peter says, is commit ourselves to our faithful Creator and continue to do good. So there's a suffering that happens simply because we live, and there's a suffering that happens because we are followers of Jesus. This type of suffering should not surprise us. It should not surprise us. Many of us, I think, and I include myself in this, have this kind of idea, whether we like to admit it or not, that suffering is actually contrary to God's will. Now, I can't believe I confess that that's sometimes my mindset, but I know it's my mindset. You know why? Because when I'm suffering, when trouble targets me, I find myself surprised. Any of you do that? Why am I so surprised that trouble targets me? Why am I so surprised that the enemies come against me? Why am I so surprised that my flesh wants to pull me away from Jesus? Why am I so surprised that the patterns and the enticement of this world tries to pull me away from Jesus? Why am I so surprised by that? Well, maybe because I kind of don't think I should go through that type of thing. Now, the reason this passage sticks out at me is this word surprise. This word surprise in the text here actually means entertaining a stranger. Get that? Don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you. Surprised, in its original context, the picture behind the word is of entertaining a stranger. What happens in your home if, quite unexpectedly, the door goes, you go to it, and you open it, and it's a group of your friends just coming in unannounced? How do you feel? Some of you love that kind of thing. Some of us will go, no! The dishes are piled up in the sink. There's a mess absolutely everywhere. You can't see me like this, right? You just can't. Now, the reason this is important, because the way we respond to trouble here through this word ties into this ancient practice of hospitality. What do you think in the ancient world, even in the Middle Eastern world today, people do when a stranger knocks on the door? Well, what do you do? You open it. You welcome the stranger in. You say, hey, do you need anything for your journey? Do you need some bread? Have you got enough water? I would hate you to actually die on the way to where you're going. Any of you want to admit, like me, that we don't do that to trouble? Can you imagine opening the door? Hello, trouble, my old friend. I've sung enough, so I'm not going to sing that one. Can you imagine that? Hello, trouble, my old friend. What are you doing here? Can I offer you anything? Anything you'd like to take? Because you know what? For me to die is Christ. For me to live is gain. Is anything you'd like? Anything you need to take on your way? You can take what you want. Isn't that the story of Job? Take what you want from me. I will not curse God and die. Luther, take what you want from me. I will not move away from the truth. As I grapple with this, I start to ask myself this question. Maybe the reason worship isn't either important or powerful to some of us is because it's never had to be. Go with me on that. It's never had to be. Maybe the reason we don't need to sing like Luther did, like the people of old did, is because fear has never gripped us, depression has never overcome us, and we've never had powerful people who have the authority to take our life stand in front of us. Could it be that many of us have never been worshipers, even come in after the music is finished, because we've never been intentionally targeted for following Jesus? Would being intentionally targeted for following Jesus change your worship? I believe it would. And I honestly think that maybe the way the enemy hinders our worship in the West is by isolating us from trouble. Believe me, being forced to wear masks, folks, was nothing in comparison to what is happening in other parts of the world. Something I honestly believe that could inspire our worship is that maybe God would grant the privilege of His church in the West receiving a healthy dose of trouble. Maybe then our worship wars would be a thing of the past. Maybe then singing a spiritual song rather than a hymn would mean as little to you as it does to the persecuted believers around the world. Have you ever worshiped with persecuted believers? Have you ever had that privilege? When we moved here, part of the conversation we had about coming was I said, hey, I'd love to come, but there's one thing I'd like you to do. I would like you to give me the permission for 3 weeks every year to travel to parts of the world where there are the church is persecuted, where believers are persecuted. And I said, I need to go there, not so much for me to minister to them, but for them to minister to me. And I would go there, and they would always thank me so much for going and everything else. And inside I would be saying, you do not know what your passionate worship is doing for me. when I'm surrounded by trouble that I cannot control, people that I cannot isolate myself from, who have I got to go to? God. And then it doesn't matter for these believers where the only instrumentation they have is a bongo under the tree. It's not about the instruments. It's about the God they encounter when they sing. It's about the truth they state when they sing. You know, in some of these places I would go, I would often say to them, could you write down, please? Could you write down your story? Vipka and I looked at a ministry that moved all over the Middle East, and they were wondering at one point in time whether Vipka and I would be there, and they gave us a book, this thick, I've still got it, of stories from persecuted believers all over the world. When I find myself that if looking at the kind of issues that are going on in front of me, I regularly pull out that book and I start to read the stories. You know why? Because it does something to me. So I used to ask these believers, could you write down your story? I stopped doing that when I heard a missionary tell a story, and I read the story as well in a book about how he was in a service with a number of persecuted believers, and they were doing Bible teaching there, and he said to the old pastor there, you know what, you really need to write these stories down. You really need to write them down. These stories are amazing. The old pastor led that missionary to a big window. And he said, tell me, pastor, he said, when you go home, do you ever bring your kids to the window and tell them to look east because the sun is about to rise? The missionary was like, no, of course I don't do that. He said, firstly, the sun always comes up in the east. It always rises in the east. And getting my kids up in the morning to look at something that happens all the time is basically something that would make no sense. And he said, pastor, the old pastor said to the missionary, he said, hey, that's how it is for us. Why on earth would we take the time to write down stories of persecution that are just a normal, everyday part of our life? Friends, when we worship, and when we worship passionately, we are taken beyond allowing our enemy, our suffering, our trouble. We stop giving them the right to control what happens with the rest of our lives. We take the focus of the struggle and we put it on a God who simply has to speak one word, and everything in my soul is made right. Worship is our weapon, because when trouble targets us, and believe me, if you are a follower of Jesus, trouble will. One way or the other. When trouble targets you, it enables you to look beyond your suffering to a God who stands behind it all and will one day, just as Hannah sang in that communion song, remove it all from us. That's the first truth. The second truth here. Worship is our weapon when we need our attitudes adjusted. When Luther wrote that hymn, he invited people to accept that their fight was not with the church. While church leaders, church members literally stood in Luther's way, Luther knew that the enemy stood behind it all. And this hymn reminded Luther of his enemy's identity. And here's the point: that realization altered the way that he viewed the people in front of him and treated them. You'll get that? See, when I suddenly realize that my fight is not with the people who oppose me, it may be with the God of this world who's blinded their eyes, who's led them to believe that their conclusions and their actions make sense, where they're totally nothing but folly. When we take our eyes off of people, put them on God, and realize who our enemy is, it alters, it adjusts the attitude that we have to the people in front of us. And it puts us in a better position to win them for Jesus. Think about it. Isn't the best way to stop my trouble for the person who's troubling me to be more like Jesus? Isn't that the best way to deal with it? Is the best way to deal with trouble to actually fight the people who are opposing you? No, all that will do is lead to more trouble or put you in prison. It is the best thing for you to run away from them. No, they can still do what they're doing to other people, to you, to other people. The best thing to do is to ultimately have your attitude adjusted so that you can win them to Jesus, right? I'm talking a lot about the persecuted church. We're coming into that season when we start to think about November. We start to think about the church around the world. Sudan is in the news right now. It's in the news because of all of the ethnic conflict that is happening. Believers are caught up in that. There was a meeting in Sudan of believers, and they were experiencing really difficult persecution. And as this persecution was being experienced, they were trying to figure out, what do we do with this? A group of guys said, look, don't we need to fight back? Because surely if we fight back, unless we fight back, it'll never stop. A number of people thought that was a great idea. And then a group of ladies said, wait a minute here. If that's what we're supposed to do, what are we supposed to do with the words of Jesus that tell us to love our enemies? And so they read this passage, Matthew 5. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Do you notice the words there? There's a purpose clause in there. Love those who persecute you so that you may be. Do you understand this? In other words, this describes the pattern of behavior of people who've truly encountered the God of their salvation. Right? There's people who claim to be it, and there's people who show it through what? Not just loving their neighbor, but loving their enemy. Why? Because God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what rewards will you get? And not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even pagans do that? So this is the encouragement. Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Can you imagine how difficult it was in that room to hear that passage read? Can you just enter into that emotionally for a second? The group heard those words and they started to discuss it. The leaders of the group started to share with these Sudanese believers how in many parts of the world, China for example, doing this thing is one of the hallmarks of spiritual maturity and one of the crucial tests for leadership. Being able to love those who oppose you, he continued, is not just a mark of spiritual maturity and an indicator that you're ready for leadership. It is also very, very practical. The Sudanese group said, what do you mean, practical? And then he shared with them that idea that persecution is not going to stop by them running away. It's not going to stop by them fighting. No, it's actually going to stop when they love their persecutors the way that God loves them, when they pray for them the way that Jesus prays for them. And when they then do that, they're going to be in a far better position to share Jesus with them. At that moment, 4 guys got up, walked towards the door. The meeting hadn't finished. And the group leader looked at these guys and said, where are you going? These guys said, we're brothers, and our families are persecuting us. And so we're going to leave right now. We're going to go home to our families, and rather than resist, we are going to love them and win them to Jesus. And when we have done that, we will be back to learn more. Wow. See, their worship enabled them, challenged them to have an attitude adjustment with the very people who were causing them so much problem. Luther penned this hymn. because he knew that that's what needed to happen with the church. Listen, the people who oppose you are not the enemy. They may well have had their minds blinded by the God of this age and the patterns of this world. But when you worship, really worship, you will know that you are, because your attitude to those who cause you so much trouble starts to shift. And believe me, this is what is called a sacrifice of praise, because it takes time to get there. It's not something that for many of us, it just happens at a click of a finger. It's something that happens as we saturate ourselves in the presence of God. Friends, this is one of those reasons why I don't listen to much secular music at all, hardly anything. All I listen to is worship music. You know why? Because I need to be in the presence of God. I need to have my attitude adjusted. I need to be in tune with the Spirit of God. And so I do it over and over and over again. Worship is so important because it adjusts our attitudes. Lastly here, worship is our weapon because words of faith change our perspective. Words of faith change our perspective. I know a number of you do what Vipka and I will do. Vipka and I will choose a word for the year. So last year, my word for the year was kindness. You'd know that if you were at Central then, because that was 7 weeks, or was it maybe even the year before? I can't remember. It was probably 2 years ago, was it? Anyway, it was basically kindness. This year, my word is sacrifice. And so I have been immersing myself in the realization that to follow Jesus is to be willing to serve. It's to be willing to sacrifice. And so I've immersed myself in this. I do this because I realize that if I focus on one word, that one word has the power to make me more like Jesus. Many of you do the same thing. One word. It has the power to set you free. One word. The psalm declares, verse 6, he lifts his voice, the earth melts. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. In the hymn at the end of verse 3, Luther actually talks about the power of one word, just one word. One word can set us free. When we worship, we ultimately, as Corey said last week, proclaim the truth of God's word over us, and one word has the power to set us free. One word. It can enslave you, one word, or it can set you free. This week we welcomed Vipka, my older two boys, Alec and Jonas, back from Germany. They went to visit our family over there. First time in a long time they've been able to do that. And while they were there, the boys sent me pictures of them playing golf on a golf course, which is in the village where Vipka's grandmother used to live. She's passed away now. When Vipka and I moved, just 6 months after we were married, from Wales to Germany, we lived in her grandparents' old Black Forest house that I think was 400 years old or whatever else it was. No warm water in the house. Can you believe that? You have to boil it all. Water was cold, folks. It was really cold. But anyway, while we lived there, they started building this golf course, and it was finished. And Alec and Jonas sent pictures of them playing golf in this course and the elevation and everything else. And honestly, I was a little bit envious. Did I repent? No. Should I have done? Yeah, probably. But anyway, I looked at this and I'm like, man, I can't believe you get to play this. My daughter must be picking up on this. She sent a little comment back on the thread, and this is what she said. Now, you'll pick up, she's not a golf fan, okay? She said, basically, I can't believe all the fuss. And then she said, isn't the point of golf, after all, to play less golf? See what she did there? Isn't the point of golf to play less golf? And I kind of laughed, and I tweeted back, Alicia, or responded back, I said, Alicia, you've just entered the world of spin, and I'm not talking about your fitness class. The whole point of golf is not to play less golf. The whole point of golf is to play fewer or less shots. Anybody who knows anything about golf would realize the way to less is always more. Much, much, much more. And Alicia, you've only been married for 6 weeks, but can I tell you, don't live out that definition with your husband. Mark loves golf. And if the whole point of golf is to live less golf, then he will trade the privilege of searching for his balls in water and in bushes and in forests for the concrete jungle of Chicago. Don't do that. Set the man free. Change the word, right? One word. One word. One word has the power to set us free. One word. Worship is so powerful because it takes us into the presence of a God who speaks at least one word to us when we worship. Now, what's interesting in the hymn, we'll sing this in a second. In the hymn, Luther says that one little word shall fell him. Specifically, he says this: the prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. Now, commentators on the hymn, people commentate on hymns as well as Bible texts. But anyway, commentators on the hymn ask themselves, what word does Luther have in mind? So they look at verse 4. Is it the word of God that he has in mind? It could be. Is it Jesus? Is that the one word? Because at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. It's the one word Jesus. Some others say, no, the one word has to be that final word in Revelation that God speaks to the enemy, and the enemy is just put into that pit of fire for all eternity. One word. What word? I just want to say this. I'm really thankful, pastorally, we don't know what that word is. You know why? Because the one word that you needed to be is the word that God speaks. The one word that you needed to be is the word that God speaks. Now, what's fascinating is at the end of this, at the end of the psalm, gone through the whole thing about the opposition. It's got to the fact that, hey, God will protect those who are his. And then it's got to the point of them coming to him. And then it says, he says, be still and know that I am God. That's the power of worship right there, be still. The first word that God speaks, desist. That's it in the Hebrew. One word, desist, stop. When you worship, God says to you, stop. Stop. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Stop. Stop fretting. Stop panicking. Stop being anxious. Stop being allowed people to rob you of your joy. Stop thinking that I don't see you. Stop thinking that I can't help you. Stop. And it's right there when we stop and we experience the presence of God through worship that God begins to minister. God adjusts our attitude. God reminds us of our purpose. And in that moment, one word of faith changes our perspective. I want to put one final scripture on the screen because I think it's important. Matthew 12:36. This comes for all believers out there. Jesus says this: I tell you that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken. Every empty word that we have spoken. You know what empty means here, the word empty? The word empty means it doesn't work. It's literally, the word empty work is no work. How many of you, when you're in trouble and under trial, issue words that don't work? They don't work for you. They don't work in your favor. They're inoperative. They have no business. And if they have no business and no power and they don't work, they have no business coming out of your mouth. Jesus here says, for by your words you will be acquitted, word of faith obviously, and by your words you will be condemned. There is a day of judgment where our response, the response of our words, are going to be judged. And what we don't want to do is to respond to trial, to opposition with words that don't work. The power of worship is that even when we don't feel like it, we are declaring words that work. We are declaring words of faith. Words that may not be true of us now, but they are words that will be true of us then. That's why we sing. And so what I want you to do is, the team are here. We're going to sing this. What I want you to do is I want you to suit up. Really, I want you to suit up. Every time you come into worship, suit up. Just recognize the major challenge in worship is putting everything that's hindered, everything that's stood in our way, everything that's brought us down, everything that's overwhelmed us to one side. And when we come in, it's as if we put our worship clothes on, our camo, right? And we just declare war. We declare war on our mind. We declare war on the enemy who seeks to rob us of joy, of hope, and of life. And we start to sing words that ultimately have faith, because these words have the power to calm our soul. These words have the power to still our mind. These words have the power to speak truth. These words have the power to adjust our attitude. So when we leave this place, we start to treat people in a way that means they are more likely to follow Jesus than they are to run away. That's why worship matters. Join with me. We're going to sing verse 3 of this older hymn. And as we do that, I pray that you would ultimately suit up for worship. Stand up with me and let's sing this song. Thanks, guys.
And though this world with devils should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath the will, His truth to triumph through us. The Prince of Darkness grim, we tremble not for Him, His rage we can endure, for lo, His doom is sure. One little word shall fail Him. And though this world with devils fill should threaten to undo us, we will not fear. We will not fear, for God hath the will, His truth to triumph through us. Whoa. Devils fill should threaten to undo us, we will not fear. We will not fear, for God hath the will, His truth to triumph through us. The Prince of Darkness grim, we tremble not for Him, His rage we can endure, for lo, His doom